They told me the garage would be warmer than it looked, but I heard the sentence that mattered. "This room is mine now, Mom." It was my son's voice, low, almost casual, as if he were claiming an extra chair at the dinner table, not the only space where I had tried to build some sense of belonging. I still remember that moment because I was standing with my hand on the dresser, touching a photograph of his father in a frame that used to sit by my bed, and I felt the words drop into me like stones into deep water, heavy and impossible to pull back. My son did not shout. He did not argue. There was no fight. It was said as fact, the way you might tell someone the sky is cloudy today or that the bus is late. It was the quietness that hurt me more than cruelty ever could. He said it as if I had no claim, as if I had never cooked him dinners after double shifts, as if I had never sold pieces of jewelry to help him with his tuition, as if every corner of my life had not been bent to make space for his. And when he said those words, I felt a strange stillness, the kind that comes not from shock, but from a recognition you do not want to admit. You see, betrayals from strangers are injuries. Betrayals from your own child are amputations. I am 81 now, and I live in a cramped apartment above a laundromat. The walls hum with the machines below, and everything smells faintly of detergent and heat, a smell that clings to my clothes and hair so much that sometimes I think I am turning into one of those forgotten coats left in a dry cleaner's bag. But it is mine. Every inch of it is mine, and I guard the key with a reverence I never used to give to the bigger houses I lived in, because here no one can tell me to leave or call me a guest in spaces I once paid for. It wasn't always like this. For years, I imagined my old age would be filled with softer moments. Family dinners where I would be asked for recipes. Birthdays where children would tug my sleeve begging me to retell the same stories about when their father was a boy. Evenings where my presence would be welcomed not as an obligation, but as a piece of home. I imagined warmth, and instead I got a garage with a space heater that rattled like an old cough. I imagined recognition, and instead I was asked to keep quiet so as not to confuse the neighbors. My story begins in that room, the one I thought was mine, the one where I stacked my folded sweaters with the carefulness of someone who knows that small acts of order are all she has left. It was a guest room, yes, but it was also the place where I let myself believe that I still belonged to the narrative of my son's life. The window overlooked a small patch of their backyard, and I used to watch the dog run laps around the garden while I sipped tea from a mug that had followed me across decades, the one chipped on the rim but still strong. It was not luxury, but it was familiar. That illusion ended the day he said, "This room is mine now." He didn't mean only the bed and the dresser. He meant the space I occupied in the architecture of his life. That is what children sometimes do when they grow into adults who think they are made entirely by themselves. They erase the scaffolding that held them up, and they pretend the house was always standing without it. When he said that sentence, something in me folded, and yet something else began to straighten. It would take time before I understood it, but in that moment, standing in the doorway of a room I had been evicted from without ceremony, I began to sense the first outline of the woman I would have to become in order to survive what was coming. People often think cruelty announces itself with shouting or slammed doors, but the deepest cuts arrive quietly, wrapped in a tone of practicality, softened by the suggestion that it is all for the best. That was how my son's wife explained it, with her voice dipped in sugar and dismissal. She said they needed the room as an office, that I would be more comfortable in the garage, that it was temporary, always temporary, like my existence in their house was a layover before a final flight to nowhere. She smiled too brightly when she said it, the way people do when they are lying but want to look generous. I nodded, because nodding is what you learn to do when your survival depends on not disturbing the surface of other people's comfort. I carried my folded sweaters, the chipped mug, the photograph of my husband, and the small box of letters I had saved over the years, down into a space that smelled of oil and dust, and I told myself it would only be for a short while. But of course, I knew better. A woman my age does not get moved back into the warm parts of the house once she has been assigned to the cold. The movement is always in one direction, and I understood that I had just been given a preview of my own funeral, a life lived at the edge, where presence is tolerated but not welcomed. That was the beginning of my new life, though I did not yet know it. At the time, all I felt was the sting of being told that the room was his, as if my decades of labor had purchased nothing more permanent than the courtesy of silence. I used to think that old age stripped you slowly, like leaves falling one by one from a tree in autumn. But I was wrong. Sometimes it happens in one sentence. One sentence. And you find yourself standing in the cold, holding all the years of your giving like they are bags of groceries no one asked you to carry. That sentence was mine. This room is mine now. It echoed, it rooted itself, and it grew. And in the weeks that followed, I would come to understand that a sentence like that is not only a rejection, it is also an invitation, if you are willing to accept it. An invitation to see the truth, to face it, and, finally, to decide that if the room is not yours, then perhaps it is time to build a place where no one can ever take away your claim. I suppose every story like mine has a moment when illusion collapses and reality steps out of the shadows. And for me, that moment came in the form of an envelope, plain and beige, with my name half erased by dust and neglect. It was not given to me, but discovered by accident, wedged between books under my son's desk, as if even the letters that carried my name had become embarrassing clutter in his house. I bent slowly, the way my body bends now, stiff and reluctant, and when I pulled the envelope free, I realized it was addressed to me, not to him, not to his wife, not to anyone else. The handwriting was my sister's, round and slightly shaky, the kind that comes from years of arthritis. But it was hers. She lives 3 states away, and I knew she must have written because she was worried, because she missed me, because she wondered why I had stopped answering the phone. My heart lurched, because I had not seen this envelope before, nor the 2 others lying beside it, one from the bank and another from an old friend. I understood instantly what it meant. They had been intercepting my mail. They had decided that my communication, my connections to the world beyond their house, were unnecessary, inconvenient, perhaps even dangerous to the arrangement they wanted. And in that moment, standing in a room I was no longer allowed to call mine, holding letters meant for me but hidden from me, I felt the unmistakable pulse of betrayal, not in the abstract sense of hurt feelings, but in the practical, concrete sense of theft. They had stolen my right to know, to answer, to be seen, and that theft was the clean, sharp cut that told me the truth. I had not simply been moved to the garage for convenience, I was being erased. The envelope trembled in my hand, not because I was weak, but because rage makes the body tremble, even when the mind tries to steady it. I sat on the edge of the bed I had once thought of as mine, though now it was called an office chair, and I opened the letter from my sister. She had written of small things, the way sisters do. The weather had been cruel. The roses in her yard had bloomed early. Her granddaughter was expecting a baby, and she hoped I was well. There was no accusation in her words, only the warmth of someone who remembers you in the rhythm of her days. And yet, reading it, I felt the sting of how easily that warmth had been taken from me by silence, not of my making. My hands shook harder, not from age but from fury, because I realized this was not a mistake. It was intentional. Someone had seen my name on an envelope and decided I did not need it, that my connections to the world were theirs to manage. Betrayal does not always roar. Sometimes it tiptoes and places its hand gently over your mouth. When my son came home that evening, I asked him about it. I tried to ask in the softest way, as though I were simply confused. I said, "David, I found some letters addressed to me under the desk. Did you put them there?" He did not look at me. He shrugged and said he thought they were unimportant, just old women's gossip. He said he didn't want me to stress, that he and Mallory had everything under control. Under control. That phrase wrapped itself around me like barbed wire. What was under their control? My mail, my finances, my place in the house, and now I began to suspect my future. I asked him about the bank envelope, and he waved his hand, dismissive, said something about junk mail and frauds targeting the elderly. He looked at me then, his eyes flat, and he added, "You don't need to worry about those things anymore. We'll take care of you." Take care of you. How often those words are used like balm but act like poison. They mean you are no longer trusted with yourself. They mean you are furniture, not flesh. They mean the decisions that once made you a person are now stripped from you in the name of protection. I nodded, because what else could I do in that moment? But inside me, a quiet fire started, and I knew the catalyst had arrived. I was not simply unwanted in the room. I was being positioned for disappearance. Later that night, when they thought I was asleep in the garage, I heard them talking. Mallory's voice was sharp, tired. She said, "We need the documents signed soon. It's better for everyone if she doesn't handle her own money anymore." My son's voice was lower, hesitant, but he did not disagree. He said, "She'll sign if I explain it. She trusts me." And Mallory answered, "Good, because I can't live like this much longer, with her here, hovering, making the place feel off. Hovering, making the place feel off." I lay in the dark, listening to their voices weaving my sentence, and I realized they were not just planning my eviction from the room. They were planning my erasure from the life I had built brick by brick with my labor, my sacrifices, my years of bending, until I nearly broke. The catalyst is not always an explosion. Sometimes it is a whispered sentence in the next room, a phrase that confirms what you already feared. That night, I understood. I was not safe in my son's house. I was tolerated until my signature could transfer what was mine into his hands. I thought of the years I had lived with less, of the nights when I worked 2 jobs so that he could have the shoes he wanted, the books for school, the security I never had. I thought of the mornings I ironed his shirts when he was older, the afternoons I stood in the bleachers watching him play, the evenings I made soup when he came home with a cold. All of that condensed into a single truth. He saw me now, not as a mother, but as an obstacle. And obstacles are to be removed. Holding that realization was like holding fire in my bare hands. It burned, but it also lit the path forward. The betrayal was complete. The mask had slipped, and I could no longer pretend this was about temporary inconvenience or generational misunderstanding. It was about power, about control, about the quiet violence families can commit when they convince themselves it is all for someone's own good. That envelope, that overheard conversation, that bland dismissal when I asked about my own mail, those were the sparks that lit the fuse. And though I sat still, though I said nothing, though I continued to nod and smile and carry my chipped mug of tea into the garage, inside me something irreversible had shifted. The world had told me the truth. I was not meant to stay here, not meant to keep waiting for scraps of kindness. I was meant to recognize the theft, to see it clearly, and to begin imagining the escape. The days after that discovery did not explode into confrontation, as one might imagine, but instead slid into a slower, more suffocating erosion, the kind that wears you down, grain by grain, until you begin to question whether you were ever whole to begin with. I did not shout at my son. I did not brandish the letters as evidence because women like me, mothers who have spent a lifetime smoothing conflicts and swallowing sharp words, rarely leap into battle. We endure, and in that endurance the cruelty grows quieter, subtler, more insidious. Each morning, I woke in the garage to the sound of the washer and dryer cycling in the room next door, the dull thrum of machinery that seemed to echo the way I had become part of the household's background noise, necessary but unseen. The space heater buzzed weakly, making the air smell of burnt dust, and condensation collected on the small window high in the wall so that I could never quite see the world outside, only the distorted shimmer of light. It was there, among the smell of cardboard boxes and motor oil, that the first escalation began, not with a dramatic eviction, but with the daily diminishment of my place in the life of the family I had raised. I began to notice how meals were timed, so that by the time I came into the kitchen, plates were already scraped clean and stacked neatly, as though the rhythm of eating had been recalibrated to exclude me. Mallory would smile when she saw me lingering near the table, her smile as precise as the fold of her linen napkins, and she would say, "Oh, I thought you'd already eaten. There are leftovers in the fridge." Leftovers, wrapped tightly in plastic, labeled with dates, as if I were a patient in some institution, rather than the woman who had once roasted whole chickens and baked loaves of bread to feed the boy who now looked through me as if I were a shadow passing on the wall. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, that busy schedules led to staggered mealtimes, but repetition is its own language, and I learned quickly that the new order of the household no longer included me at the table. Conversations, too, began to slip into a register where I was present in body, but absent in recognition. I would enter the living room to find my son and his wife bent over laptops, their voices hushed, laughter spilling between them, the kind of private language couples cultivate when they are sure no one else deserves entry. If I asked what was funny, the answers were vague, dismissive, designed to make me feel intrusive. If I lingered too long, Mallory would stretch her hand toward the baby monitor, pretending to check on the child. But the gesture always ended with her gaze landing on me like a subtle warning. Enough. Leave us our space. Even the baby, my grandchild, was shielded from me under the pretense of fragile routines. Don't wake her. Don't hold her too long. Don't kiss her face. She might get sick. The child grew in front of me like a flower in a neighbor's yard, visible but untouchable, and I realized that even the smallest intimacy, the act of rocking her to sleep or pressing my cheek to her warm head, had been taken from me. The house itself began to speak a language of exclusion. Once, my sweaters had been neatly stacked in the closet of the guest room, but now that space was lined with binders, office supplies, and framed certificates, as though my brief occupancy had been scrubbed from memory. My shoes were moved from the hallway to a plastic tub in the garage, my toothbrush relocated from the bathroom sink to a drawer, as though the sight of my things disrupted the curated cleanliness Mallory prized. These were not accidents. They were signals, and I read them all too clearly. The family I had imagined myself part of was orchestrating a slow erasure, and I was expected to cooperate by vanishing without protest. What deepened the wound was not only the exclusion, but the politeness with which it was carried out. Mallory never raised her voice, never used cruel words. Instead, she wrapped her dismissal in the softest tones. "You're so independent. It's amazing," she would say, when she left me to carry groceries alone from the car. "You like your quiet time, don't you?" she would add, when she shut the garage door behind me. Her words were a performance of kindness that left me doubting myself, wondering if perhaps I was misinterpreting what was happening, if perhaps I really was better off eating alone, living in the drafty corner of their house, and being spoken of as a guest. This is how cruelty works when it wants to wear a mask. It convinces you that your pain is simply your imagination, that the ache in your chest is gratitude misfired. But the body knows. The body knows when the warmth has gone. Mine told me through the stiffness in my shoulders as I bent to lift boxes in the garage, through the tightness in my throat when I tried to swallow food eaten alone, through the heaviness in my legs as I lingered in doorways where conversation stopped the moment I entered. The escalation was not dramatic, and yet it was relentless. I had become invisible in the very house I had helped make possible, and the invisibility pressed against me until I began to vanish, even to myself. One evening, as I sat in the garage pretending to read a book, I overheard my son on the phone. His voice carried through the thin wall, sharper than usual, tinged with exasperation. He said, "She's fine. She doesn't need to be involved. Honestly, it's easier this way." I did not know to whom he was speaking, perhaps a banker, perhaps a lawyer, perhaps Mallory's parents, but the sentence cut deeper than any direct insult. She doesn't need to be involved. I had raised him, clothed him, fed him, shielded him from the cold, and now in the architecture of his life I was a bystander, an uninvolved party, a complication to be managed quietly. That sentence did not shout, but it screamed inside me, and I felt the last remnants of denial peel away. The nights became longer then. I would lie awake listening to the creak of the house above me, the rhythm of footsteps, the muffled sound of laughter or arguments, and I would feel myself sinking into the knowledge that I was no longer wanted. I had been demoted from mother to guest, from guest to burden, from burden to problem. The escalation was not that they pushed me out of the house in one violent motion. It was that they taught me to understand my own displacement as inevitable, as if every breath I took under their roof was borrowed air. And yet, beneath the heaviness, something else stirred. Perhaps it was the stubbornness of survival, the muscle memory of all the years I had endured hardship before, the widowhood that had not killed me, the jobs that had ground me down but never erased me. In the middle of this erasure, a small thought began to grow. If they want me invisible, perhaps I can use that invisibility to move silently, to prepare, to imagine another kind of life beyond the garage door. It was only a flicker then, fragile and uncertain. But it was enough to keep me from collapsing entirely into the role they had scripted for me. The first escalation, then, was not in their actions, but in my awareness. The stripping away of my place at the table, my voice in conversations, my belongings from the rooms, my presence from the photographs. All of it escalated into a clarity that could no longer be ignored. I was being erased, yes, but I was also awakening. And though the garage was cold and the nights were long, I began to understand that what they intended as confinement might one day become the seed of my escape. The moment of change did not arrive with any fanfare, no dramatic argument or sudden revelation, but with something as small and ordinary as a cardigan. It was late in the evening. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and I had crept out of the garage to retrieve the sweater I had forgotten draped across the back of the chair in the dining room. I told myself it was just for warmth, just a quick errand before returning to the space where I was expected to stay invisible. But when I walked back through the hallway, past the door of the room that had once been mine, I noticed it was not closed all the way. The sliver of light from the hallway stretched across the carpet like a finger pointing, and something in me, some instinct born of years of listening carefully in order to survive, told me to pause. I pushed the door open a little more, and the smell of paper and stale air greeted me. My son had already turned the room into his office, the bed removed, the dresser crowded with files and binders, the nightstand where I once placed my glasses now holding a tangle of wires and chargers. It looked stripped of memory, scrubbed of me, yet when I bent to pick up a slipper, I thought I had left behind. My hand brushed against something hidden just under the bed frame. A cardboard box, taped loosely, its edge jutting out as if it wanted to be found. I knelt slowly, my joints protesting, but my curiosity sharper than my pain. I pulled the box out and set it on the floor, the cardboard soft and worn from being handled. I hesitated, half afraid of what I might find, half certain that whatever was inside would tell me what I already suspected. When I opened it, I felt the room tilt slightly, not because of dizziness, but because what I saw confirmed the truth that had been circling me like a shadow. Inside were envelopes, many of them, all addressed to me, all unopened, all hidden away. Some from friends, some from my sister, some from banks and agencies, each one a thread of my life cut and tucked out of sight. My heart pounded, and I picked up the first letter. It was from a cousin who had sent me a photograph of her son's wedding. I had never known it happened. Another was from the insurance company about a policy I had taken out decades ago. Another from the community center where I once volunteered, inviting me to a reunion. All of them stolen. All of them meant for me. All of them intercepted and hidden under a bed in a room I had been forced out of. And beneath the stack of envelopes lay something colder still, a folder neatly labeled, with my name on it. My hands shook as I opened it and saw pages of legal documents, papers that spoke of power of attorney, transfer of assets, phrases like, in the event of diminished capacity, words that turned me from a person into a case, an obligation, a problem to be solved. My name was written in ink, not in my hand, but forged by someone who believed my signature was theirs to control. I sat on the floor, the folder open in my lap, and felt the years roll back. all the way to when I first held my son as a baby, when I thought his life would be my redemption, my reason, my future. I thought of his small hands clutching my blouse, the way he once whispered that he was afraid of the dark, and how I had promised him I would never let anything hurt him. And now, here he was, hurting me not with fists or screams, but with ink and silence, with the kind of betrayal that makes you doubt your very existence. But something shifted in me as I sat there. Perhaps it was the shock finally crystallizing into clarity. Perhaps it was the memory of all the women before me. My mother, my grandmother, women who had endured and survived their own silences. But I felt a new current stir in my chest. I realized that I could not go back to being the obedient shadow they wanted me to be, the silent figure tucked away in the garage. If I accepted this, I would disappear completely. And for the first time in a long time, I did not want to disappear. I wanted to be seen, even if only by myself. So I closed the folder, slid the letters back inside the box, and carried it quietly with me out of the room. My hands trembled as I held it against my chest, but my steps were steady. In the garage, I placed the box beside my cot and sat looking at it for a long time. The papers inside were not only evidence of betrayal, but also a strange kind of gift, because they had forced me to confront the truth I had been trying to ignore. I was not safe here. Not emotionally, not legally, not spiritually. And if I wanted to keep even the smallest piece of myself, I would have to act. The cardigan I had gone to retrieve lay forgotten on the chair. What I had really retrieved was the first flicker of my own agency. The shift was not loud, not visible to anyone else. My son and his wife continued with their routines, believing I was compliant, docile, contained. But inside me, something had awakened. I began to make small notes to myself, writing down phone numbers from the envelopes, memorizing addresses, keeping track of dates. I hid a little cash in the lining of my purse, the way I had once done when I was young and learning to survive in a world that rarely made room for women like me. I told myself I was only preparing, only gathering. But I knew that what I was really doing was building a way out. At night, when I lay on the cot, listening to the hum of the machines below, I imagined places I might go. Small towns where no one knew me. Apartments where I could arrange my belongings without apology. Quiet cafes where I could sip tea without being watched for how long I stayed. The images grew sharper each night, and with them grew a kind of determination I had not felt in years. I remembered that once, long ago, I had been capable of starting over, of building something from nothing. Why not again? Age had taken my speed, my strength, but not my mind, not my will. They had tried to convince me I was already gone, but I was still here, alive, aware, ready. That night, with the box under my cot, was the midpoint of my story, though I did not name it then. It was the turning point when grief began to harden into resolve, when betrayal stopped being something happening to me and began to be something I could respond to. I was not yet free, not yet safe, but I had shifted. I was no longer only their mother, their burden, their problem. I was once again myself, and for the first time in years, I began to plan what I would do with that self. The weeks after I discovered that box became a slow tightening of the rope, as if each day drew me closer to some reckoning I had not chosen, but could no longer avoid. At first, I thought perhaps I could bide my time, hold the knowledge in silence until I found the right moment to slip away. But life inside that house had a way of pressing against me, testing the limits of my patience and reminding me that delay was its own kind of death. I began to see clearly how their every gesture, every polite dismissal, every decision made in whispers behind closed doors was part of a pattern meant to push me further and further into the shadows. The first escalation had been subtle: the quiet exclusion from meals, the removal of my belongings, the soft-voiced insistence that the garage was a place of privacy. The second escalation came with more weight, more force, not through violence, but through a kind of tightening net, a pressure that told me plainly I was running out of time. It started with the papers, of course. They had not abandoned the plan to strip me of legal authority. One morning, Mallory appeared at the garage door with a tray of tea. She set it down on the small folding table by my cot, smiling too brightly, the way she always did when she was trying to sell me a lie, and she said she thought it would be good for us to have a chat. I nodded, though my chest tightened with suspicion, and she began to speak about how complicated finances had become, how expensive the house was, how much stress David was under, trying to keep everything afloat. She spoke of taxes and insurance, bills and savings, as though I were a stranger incapable of understanding the basics of money, though I had once stretched every dollar across rent and food and medicine when she was still a teenager living comfortably in her parents' house. Then she slid a document across the table, her smile never faltering, and said gently, "This will just simplify things. Make sure you're not burdened with paperwork you don't need to worry about anymore. It's just to make things easier." I looked at the document. I did not even need to read every word to know what it was. Power of attorney. The slow theft of my independence, disguised as protection. I let my fingers rest on the paper, and I looked at her smile, and I thought of all the times I had smiled like that myself, covering disappointment or fear so that no one else would feel its weight. But her smile was not born of love or sacrifice. It was the grin of control, the grin of someone who believed they had already won. I slid the paper back to her and said softly, "I'll think about it." She nodded, still smiling, but I saw the flicker of irritation in her eyes. That was when I knew she would not wait forever for me to sign. From that day, the air in the house changed. I felt their impatience humming like a low current. Conversation stopped when I entered the room, not out of politeness, but out of strategy. They no longer asked me simple questions about what I wanted for dinner or how I felt after my doctor's appointment. Instead, they began to speak around me, about me, as though I were already absent. "She should probably cut back on walking. Her knees can't handle it. She forgets things. It's getting worse. Maybe she'd be happier in a place with people her age." I sat in the chair by the window, invisible, listening to the way they built a case against me in small daily comments, each one designed to plant the idea that I was no longer competent, no longer reliable, no longer deserving of autonomy. And the more they repeated these things, the more I feared they would become truth in the ears of others. The real blow came from the one person I had thought might still see me. My grandson, a boy of 12, stepped into the garage one afternoon. He was carrying a tablet, his fingers moving quickly across the screen, but when he looked up at me, his face held something I did not recognize. "Mom says you get confused a lot," he said. "Is that true?" The question was innocent in its phrasing, but devastating in its implication. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I was more lucid now than perhaps I had ever been, that my clarity was born of necessity. But instead, I only shook my head and smiled gently. unwilling to drag him into the ugliness of what his parents were doing. He shrugged, unconvinced, and wandered back into the house. And I sat staring at the space he had left behind, realizing that even the children were being taught to see me not as a grandmother, but as a fading figure, a problem to be solved. The escalation deepened further when I overheard a phone call late at night. David was speaking in the kitchen, his voice low but carrying. He said, "Yes, we'll have the papers signed soon. She doesn't argue much. I think she knows it's for the best. No, she won't be in the way much longer." I held my breath, listening, my chest aching with the effort. And when he hung up the phone, I sat there in the dark garage, trembling not with fear, but with fury. I realized then that what I had hoped was only Mallory's doing had in fact become his choice too. My son, my own blood, had not only agreed, but had begun to orchestrate my disappearance from my own life. It was in those days that I began to prepare more deliberately. I kept the box hidden beneath my cot, but I also began to carry with me at all times 1 or 2 letters that I could use as proof if needed. I memorized the phone numbers of the people I trusted, though they were few. I even spoke quietly with the woman who lived 2 houses down, a retired nurse who walked her dog past the driveway every morning. She had always greeted me kindly, and one morning I asked her how she managed her mail now that she was older. She looked at me strangely, then said she kept her own mailbox key and never let anyone else collect it. I nodded, and in that moment she seemed to understand something unspoken. She placed her hand lightly on mine and said, "If you ever need help, I'm here." It was a small gesture, a neighbor's courtesy, but to me it was like being thrown a rope in a storm. Still, inside the house, the pressure mounted. Mallory became more insistent, pressing the papers toward me on different occasions, always with that sugary tone. "It's just easier, really. You don't want to deal with all those numbers and forms. This way, David can handle everything for you." I smiled, nodded, said I would think about it, but inside, I felt the ticking of a clock. They would not wait forever, and I would not allow them to win. The climax of this escalation came one Sunday afternoon. The family was hosting friends, couples from their neighborhood who spoke loudly about investments and vacations. I was seated in the corner, a polite accessory, introduced as David's mother visiting for a while. At some point, I excused myself to the kitchen, where I overheard Mallory speaking with one of the women. "We're managing her affairs now," she said, in that calm, competent tone of hers. "It's really the best thing. She gets so overwhelmed. Honestly, it's a relief for everyone." I stood frozen, hearing my life reduced to a burden, my identity recast as incompetence. Something inside me hardened then. If they thought I was already erased, then perhaps it was time to prove that I was not. That night, when the guests had left and the house was quiet, I sat on the cot in the garage and opened the folder again. I read every word, slowly, carefully, making sure I understood the full extent of what they were trying to do. And as I read, I realized that knowledge itself was my weapon. They thought me weak, confused, diminished. They had no idea that I saw them clearly, that I knew what they were doing, that I was already preparing my escape. The second escalation was not just their pressure, not just their insistence on the papers, not just the poisoning of the children's perception of me, though it was all of that. The second escalation was also the sharpening of my own resolve. Each insult, each dismissal, each attempt to control me only carved the truth deeper into me. I could not stay. If I did, they would succeed in turning me into exactly what they wanted me to be: a silent, compliant absence. I would rather walk into the unknown with nothing but a small bag and a handful of dollars than allow them to write me out of my own story. And so I began to wait, not with despair, but with intention. I was no longer the woman sitting in the garage wondering how she had ended up forgotten. I was the woman watching, listening, gathering strength. I knew that soon something would break open. Some moment would arrive when I could step out. And when it did, I would be ready. They thought they were tightening the rope, but with each pull, they were teaching me how to cut it. That was the truth of the second escalation. It was not only the moment they pressed harder, it was the moment I began to press back, quietly, secretly, but with a determination they could not yet imagine. The breaking point did not come as a scene of shouting or slammed doors, though in some secret place of my heart I had once imagined myself finally screaming at them, demanding to know how they could turn on the woman who had given them everything. Instead, the climax arrived with a quiet decision that felt as irreversible as a death. It began with a phone call I made one morning while David and Mallory were out shopping. I sat in the garage with the box on my lap, the folder open, and I dialed the number from one of the envelopes they had hidden from me, the one from the lawyer who had managed my husband's estate years before. My voice shook as I introduced myself, half afraid he would tell me I was mistaken, that I no longer had any claim. But when I explained who I was, he said at once, "We thought you had passed away. Your son told us you were no longer capable of handling your own affairs." Those words sliced through me, but they also ignited something. I said clearly, "I am very much alive, and I am very much capable." He was silent for a moment, then asked me to come see him in person, to bring any documents I still had. That was when I knew there was no turning back. I spent that entire night preparing. I tucked the letters into my bag, slipped a little cash into my shoe, wrote down the address of the law office. I told myself I would leave at dawn, before they could stop me, before they could take the folder from me. The garage was cold, but inside me a heat grew, a fire I had not felt in decades. The kind of fire that comes when you finally remember that you are not powerless. You are not voiceless. You are not finished. I lay on the cot with my eyes wide open, waiting for the first streak of light through the small window. And when it came, I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked out of that garage as though I were walking out of a coffin. The bus ride to the lawyer's office was long and jarring, each stop and start a reminder of the distance between the life I had been living and the life I was stepping into. When I arrived, the receptionist looked at me kindly, offered me water, and when I sat across from the lawyer, I saw in his eyes both surprise and respect. I laid the folder on his desk and told him everything, not in a rush, not with tears, but with the steady voice of someone who has decided that the truth will no longer be hidden. He listened, nodding, reading through the papers, and finally he said, "These signatures are forged. They cannot stand." Relief flooded me, but it was not gentle. It was sharp, searing, like the release of a wound that has been festering for too long. He assured me that steps could be taken immediately, that my son would not be able to claim authority over me, that my rights could be restored in full. I thanked him, and when I left the office, the city seemed louder, brighter, almost unbearable, but also alive, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that I was alive too. The true climax, though, came later, when David realized what I had done. He came into the garage that evening, his face pale, his eyes wide, the polite mask stripped away. He asked me, his voice low but trembling, "Did you go to the lawyer?" I looked at him, my son, the boy I had once carried in my arms, and I said simply, "Yes." He stared at me, struggling to form words, then said, "Why would you do that? We were trying to help you." And in that moment, everything I had swallowed for weeks, months, perhaps years, rose to the surface. I said, "Help me? You tried to erase me. You hid my letters. You lied about my mind. You stole my voice. That is not help. That is theft." My voice was not loud, but it was steady, and for the first time, he could not look away. Mallory appeared in the doorway, her smile gone, her face tight with anger. But I did not look at her. I looked only at my son, and I said, "I am leaving. I will not stay here another night." He began to speak, to protest, to tell me I was overreacting, but I raised my hand and he stopped. I picked up my bag, already packed, and I walked past them, through the house that had once been mine but no longer carried my scent, and I opened the front door. The air outside was cool, carrying the faint smell of cut grass and evening rain, and it felt like stepping into another country. I did not wait for them to follow. I did not turn to see if they watched me go. I walked down the driveway, past the roses Mallory had planted, past the mailbox where so many letters to me had died unopened, and I kept walking until the house was out of sight. The climax was not in the confrontation itself, but in the act of leaving. There are decisions that, once made, cannot be undone, and this was one of them. I had taken back my name, my rights, my life, and though I did not know exactly where I would sleep that night or how I would build a new existence, I knew I could never again return to that garage, that house, that silence. I had crossed a threshold, and on the other side was not certainty, not comfort, but something far greater, dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, is something no one can take from you again. That was the moment my story turned from survival to freedom. I had been pushed, pressed, erased, but I had risen. I had acted. And nothing, not even my own son's disappointment or anger, could undo it. I live now in a small apartment above a laundromat, and every morning the machines downstairs wake before I do, their endless tumbling and whirring filling the air with a faint scent of detergent that clings to my curtains and hair. And sometimes I think I smell like a freshly washed sheet, even when I have not done laundry in days. The space is not large, just 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen with cabinets that do not quite close. But it is mine. Every corner of it belongs to me alone. And that simple truth is more precious than any polished house with gardens and guest rooms where I am treated as a burden. Here, no one tells me to eat leftovers in silence. No one moves my sweaters into boxes. No one intercepts my letters. Here, if I leave a cup on the table, it waits for me exactly where I placed it. And that waiting is a kind of loyalty. At first, when I left David's house, I thought the loneliness might kill me, because habit is a strange prison, and even when it hurts you, it still feels familiar, still binds you with invisible cords. The silence at night seemed heavy, almost unbearable, and I caught myself reaching for the rhythms of their house. The sound of Mallory closing cupboards too firmly, the thud of my son's footsteps on the stairs, even the cries of the baby I was never allowed to comfort. But slowly, the silence became something else. It became a canvas. Into it, I poured my own voice, humming softly while I brewed tea. reading aloud to myself the letters I finally received without interception, speaking prayers in the dark not for rescue but for steadiness. The silence, once oppressive, began to feel like freedom stretching itself across the walls. I reconnected with people I thought I had lost forever. My sister's letters resumed, each one a reminder that there was still someone in the world who thought of me not as an inconvenience, but as blood, as memory, as home. Old friends answered my phone calls with joy, surprised but grateful that I had not disappeared after all. I even began attending a small community group for women of my age, most of them widows, many of them with stories not unlike mine, stories of being dismissed, patronized, ignored, or betrayed by children who once relied on them for everything. We sit in a circle of metal chairs in a church basement, and we speak, sometimes haltingly, sometimes with tears, but always with the fierce honesty that comes only when you have nothing left to lose. In those faces, I see myself reflected, not as a victim, but as part of a lineage of women who refuse to vanish. And I think often of my son. I do not pretend that the wound has healed. Some wounds are meant to be carried, not erased. But I do not allow that wound to define me either. I loved him, and perhaps in some corner of me I still do. But love does not mean surrendering to destruction. Love does not mean letting yourself be erased. Sometimes love means walking away, so that you do not disappear inside the shadows of someone else's fear or greed. I have not spoken to him in many months, and perhaps I never will again. If he calls, I may answer, but if he does not, I will not chase him. I gave him my years, my labor, my body, my hope. Now I give myself what remains. When I sit by the small window above the laundromat, watching people carry baskets of clothes in and out, I think of the box I found under the bed in that house. The box is gone now, burned, the ashes scattered, but in my mind it remains, not as evidence of betrayal, but as the symbol of the moment I chose to act. For it was not the cruelty alone that defined me. It was the decision I made when faced with it. That decision, to rise, to walk, to reclaim my name, was the truest inheritance I could ever give myself. So this is my resolution, not a happy ending wrapped in ribbons, but a steady continuation of breath, of being, of dignity. I wake each day and I make my tea. I fold my sweaters neatly into the drawer. I open my mail and I read it immediately, relishing the act of holding words that are mine and mine alone. I am not waiting for reconciliation. I am not waiting for apology. I am not waiting to be invited back into a house where I was never meant to stay. I am waiting only for the sun to rise each morning so that I can greet it, alive and unowned. And if you are a woman reading this, sitting in a corner somewhere, told that your place is temporary, that your voice is too small, that your memory is fading, hear me when I say this. You are not furniture to be moved. You are not a problem to be solved. You are not a room to be reassigned. You are flesh and history, blood and will, and no matter how quietly they try to erase you, you can still choose to step out, to stand, to claim what is yours. I did. And though the path is narrow and the nights are sometimes long, it is mine, wholly mine. And that is enough.